Hello and welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we're having a look at Helya in the Trial of Valor on the 7.1 PTR.
So this is the last boss in this raid, and it's quite an epic encounter. It's a 3-phase fight, and it has various different callbacks to the Moral Souls 5-man dungeon, except this time, of course, you get to do a far larger dent into Helya's face than you did previously. Now do note before we do cover this boss and explain all the abilities and how you may have to tackle them once they hit live servers, this is a preview of the encounter. As soon as this boss is available next week, we'll do a guide for her as well as for Gorm and Odin, so look out for those on our channel soon. And also, if you've come to this video looking primarily just for Phase 3 tips, unfortunately we didn't get into Phase 3. However, Phase 3 has a lot of mechanics from both Phase 1 and 2, and they're basically merged together and you have to deal with all of them at the exact same time. So if you can get a good understanding of Phase 1 and 2, you'll probably be okay with 3. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of the video on, talking about every single ability that you have to deal with, how we dealt with it, and our general feedback of the encounter as well. So let's go straight into it. Let's talk about Phase 1.
Now Helya has a set of abilities that she'll be using throughout Phase 1 on a rotation until she hits 65% health, where she'll swim away and Phase 2 will begin. So let's talk about those abilities. One of them is Orb of Corruption. This will make several purple orbs spawn near players and fixate them. These orbs will pulse out AoE damage to anyone nearby, and if you are hit by one of these pulses, you'll gain a debuff which increases the damage you take from these orb pulses by 100%. So you want to remain spread for when the orbs are about to come in, so you don't get all of them on top of one another and you might get caught out, and then you just want to kite the orbs away from the group towards the edges of the room so you don't have a bunch of orbs flying around that everyone needs to dodge. Another one of her abilities that will come in quite often is Tentacle Strike. This will make a tentacle spawn in one of two locations, either right next to Helya or at the far back of the platform. This tentacle will then slam into the ground, dealing damage which is split between everyone that is hit by it within its targeting area. However, if nobody is hit by this tentacle, then it will just do an absolutely huge amount of damage to your raid and most likely one-shot you. So the idea is, of course, is that you soak it. We decided to have as many people as possible stand within the tentacle that spawned near Helya, as melee and the majority of the raid were nearby. However, with the tentacle that spawned away from Helya at the back of the room, we just decided to have one person stand within it and soak it with an immunity, such as Turtle or Ice Block. This way nobody else had to move towards it and general raid damage was lowered. You just got to make sure that you do soak each one of these tentacle strikes, otherwise you're in for a whole world of pain.
Now, an ability that you saw in the 5-man version of the encounter is also in play here in the raid. The boss will apply a debuff called Taint of the Sea to multiple players in your raid. While you have this debuff, you take a very high amount of ticking damage, and as a result, you have to dispel it because otherwise it's just a pain to heal. When that player is dispelled though, they'll leave a large green swirly circle on the ground, which will then explode a short time afterwards, and if you're stood in it, you're going to die. Now this debuff always seemed to apply to the tank, which was pretty annoying because really you want to instantly dispel them, and even on the tank you kinda should, but it does make things awkward when it comes down to the bile water breath. Now this gigantic cone is always placed on top of your tank that is top of threat. It deals a large amount of damage and applies a debuff which reduces your armor by 100% for 30 seconds, so this forces you to taunt after each breath. You just taunt on one, as simple as that. If a tank has the Taint of the Sea debuff, we actually found it better to wait until the breath was finished to dispel it, just to make sure that the tank wasn't forced to move and then suddenly have the breath on the entire raid. And if the breath does hit the raid, it's not only an issue because it does damage and also applies a horrible debuff, but the breath also spawns a load of slimes. Now these slimes don't do anything apart from sit there and channel for 20 seconds. At the end of this 20-second channel, the blobs will explode, which causes them to die, but it also causes them to deal a massive amount of damage to the raid, and also spawn a large pool of green goo, which deals ticking damage to anyone that stood inside it. However, the less health the blobs have when they actually finish their channel, the less damage they'll deal to the raid, and also the smaller the pool of shit will be. So as soon as the breath came in, we just had our tank stood on the edges of the platform, not too far over though, because if you're right on the edges, the boss will actually spawn the blobs right on top of the platforms on your left and your right hand side. If that happens, you're pretty much fucked because otherwise you have to run around and kill them. Not good. So just make sure that you're not completely right up against the edges. The blobs will spawn, get all your DPS to switch them and just blow them up as much as you possibly can. You can actually kill all of them. We managed to do that a couple of times. But once this hits live servers, I doubt that will be the case every single time. And that's all the abilities that you have to deal with in Phase 1. As you can see, you know, there isn't too many of them and they're not particularly difficult to deal with. But if you do mess up on them in one way or another, you are definitely going to be punished for it. The damage from the orbs or the slam on the ground, or even just not killing the blobs quick enough, is just deadly. Everything in this phase is deadly. But if you do manage to deal with all those abilities and you get the boss to 65% health, you will transition into phase 2. But keep in mind, going into this phase, you really don't want blobs up. We did this a couple of times, and almost every time it did happen, it was a wipe. This next phase is all about controlling and killing off ads, and if you go into the phase with even more ads right from the start, it's a wipe. So yeah, make sure you don't transition with blobs up.
Now, as soon as you enter phase 2, she will retreat away from the encounter area and you'll no longer be fighting her directly. Instead, multiple things will happen at once. A massive tidal wave will go across the room, and although it deals very little damage at the moment, each time these waves do come in, and they will be coming in quite frequently, they will be dealing more and more damage each time she sends one your way. Now, on this first tidal wave, 2 large ads will arrive on these little ghost boats. You will have 1 Grime Lord to deal with and 1 Nightwatch Mariner to deal with. Now, we decided to kill the Nightwatch Mariner first because of the Lantern of Darkness, and if you've done the 5-man, you realise why, and this is like a super empowered version. If he's up for too long, he will start channeling this ability and it'll deal a ton of ticking damage to the raid over 6 seconds, and this damage, on top of everything else that is going on, is super deadly. So, we make sure that we nuke this guy off nice and quickly. On top of this, he does have a couple other things that he'll be doing. He has Ghostly Rage, which will increase his attack speed by 30% for 6 seconds. Just have your tank use active mitigation for this. It isn't a huge amount of damage going in on them. However, for the raid to worry about is an ability called Give No Quarter. Just like the mini-boss before Helya in the Maw of Souls, this will just make a ghostly shadow come towards a player and deal damage to them if they're stood in that area. However, unlike the 5-man version, you do have a white swirly circle to indicate exactly where it's going. Just make sure you move from it and don't take the extra damage. Now, the Nightwatch Mariner will fall pretty quickly. However, the Grime Lord, that's a slightly different story. This guy has a ton more health and he's very unfriendly towards your melee, mainly because of an ability called Sludge Nova. This is a stomp dealing a large amount of damage to anyone within 15 yards and it will also knock them back, so you got to make sure that you move away from it, which means that you'll have downtime while you're trying to fight him if you're a melee DPS. On top of this, he has an ability that he'll cast on the tank called Anchor Slam. This will do a large burst of damage to that tank and anyone nearby, knocking them into the air and causing them to take 400% extra damage for 6 seconds. This hurts a lot, and if melee get hit by this, they're almost certainly one-shot. For the tanks, we just made sure that they used a large cooldown for this, or if it was really bad and they didn't have a large cooldown, we just had the other tank taunt off of them when the Anchor Slam was cast. Now, apart from just fucking over your melee the whole time, he also has an ability called Fetid Rot. This is a debuff placed on a few members of the raid which will deal ticking damage to them, whilst reducing the healing they take by 15% per stack. Now, the stacks will fall off over the course of the duration, just make sure you spot heal them if needed, but once the debuff has timed out on a player, they'll do a burst of damage to anyone within 5 yards and spread the debuff to them. So as a result of this, you definitely need to be spread because otherwise it will spread like a plague throughout your entire group. As soon as you got the debuff on you, make sure nobody is nearby you so you can drop it off before it spreads throughout your group. Now, apart from these 2 large ads that you have to deal with, you also notice that there's a bunch of tentacles around the room. You have 3 at the back and 3 around each of the elevated platforms at the sides of the room. These tentacles don't do anything, however they need to be killed off in order for you to get into phase 3. So you want to be dealing as much damage to the 2 big ads as you possibly can, whilst cleaving as much damage as possible onto the tentacles. We decided with the first ads that we got to tank them near the tentacles at the back of the room, as you won't always be able to fight downstairs because there'll be a bunch of waves there and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we made sure that we used the time that we had downstairs to do as much damage to the tentacles as possible, whilst killing off the 2 giant ads that are absolutely annihilating your raid. Now, shortly after you kill off those 2 big ads, you'll see the 3rd type of ad in this phase, which is a decaying minion. A bunch of these will spawn all around the room and they'll just fixate a random player and melee hit them. And these melee hits don't do that much damage. However, they do gain a stacking damage buff that will just keep ramping up. And around the 10 to 15 stack marks, each one of these melee hits is actually hitting pretty goddamn hard. So hopefully the ads are dead by then. When they do die, they will leave a big pool of green shit on the floor. This green shit will just deal ticking damage to anyone stood inside, so it's kind of shit if it's in an area that you're trying to fight in. However, this goo is washed away when any of the waves go through the encounter area. In order to deal with these mobs, we just tried to group them up and CC them together and just AoE them down. Luckily, you can funnel them into certain choke points, such as the staircases on either sides of the room, which you will be using as on a timer, Helya will bombard the raid with several waves in a row. And in order to avoid them, you need to retreat to one of the elevated platforms. During this time, we decided just to clear up any leftover decaying minions. We generally had the range DPS deal with that, whilst having the melee DPS and anyone who's left over deal as much damage to the tentacles whilst you're on that platform. Once the waves have subsided, the last wave that will come in will give you one new Grime Lord and one new Nightwatch Mariner, and the phase will just repeat from there. So the whole idea of this phase seems to just be dealing as much damage to the tentacles whilst making sure that you don't get overwhelmed with either the big adds or too many of the decaying minions. And then otherwise it's just choreographed movement, making sure the raid moves as a single unit to the correct places at the correct time. Because if anyone happens to go to the wrong platform during a wave phase, they might have an add or two on them and they'll get some damage on them and they're most likely going to die very, very quickly. However, if you all move as one unit, you can go up on one of the elevated platforms, clear out all the tentacles, come back down, clear out any of the tentacles in the lower area, and then when the new set of waves come in, you can then go up onto the other elevated platform and clear up there. That's the whole idea. It's just this sort of very slow, arduous stance as you're trying to kill off all of these adds, whilst trying to get into phase 3 by killing off the tentacles as soon as you possibly can.
And as we said at the beginning, we didn't get into phase 3. When we was about to get there multiple times, she simply just despawned. But of course we can still speculate exactly how this last phase works. And as we said at the start of the video, it is a mashup of phase 1 and phase 2 with slight mechanical twist on the abilities. From phase 1 you'll still have Taint the Sea debuff, and it appears that it's going to be exactly the same. You still have the Orb of Corruption from phase 1, however, as it pulses around the room as you're kiting it, it's also going to leave puddles on the ground. This is going to make positioning pretty difficult. I guess you'll probably want to pre-spread and try and be at the sides of the room or the back of the room as much as possible just to keep all the goo out of the raid, which is probably going to be really important because of how the breath works in this last phase as well, because instead of leaving adds on the ground, it's going to put bolts instead, and these bolts just deal damage to the entire raid and apply a nasty healing absorption shield on them. However, if players stand in the bolts before it lands, they take it instead, so you can have individual players rather than the entire raid. And if these bolts spawn inside goo, it's going to make things a complete pain in the arse. However, you do have the waves from phase 2, which means that they're going to be clearing up all the goo from the Orbs of Corruption, which is going to help you a lot. But sadly from phase 2 you will have to deal with the Nightwatch Mariner, so you're going to need to swap to it as soon as possible just to kill her off before she starts casting the Lantern of Darkness ability. But you're also going to have decaying minions, which again is just going to be even more goo on the ground, making dealing with that breath mechanic as well as the orbs very, very difficult. But we'll have to see how that goes down, and once again, once this boss is on live servers, we'll get a video out as soon as we possibly can. So, feedback. It's a very cool fight.
Yeah, I really like how it uses the environment really, really well. Like using the two elevated platforms on either side to avoid the sea coming in, and the way that the ads spawn in as well on little boats. That's pretty cool.
It is cool.
There's nice little finishing touches to this fight, and I really liked how the phases felt very different from one another. Like, you had phase 1, which was mainly to do with nuking the boss and, of course, dealing with the blobs. But it was mainly, like, nuking with Helya and dealing with her. And then you have to deal with loads of hordes of ads in phase 2. And you've got some callbacks to the trash that you fought in More Souls, which was pretty nice. But they had, like, a little twist, and they actually feel very challenging to deal with. And then you've got probably the horrible mix of stuff in phase 3, which is going to be a nice,
which is going to be
weird,
horrible.
Yeah, it's going to be horrible, but it's going to be a cool mix of both phases. It looks to be very, very good.
Yeah, and if you've looked at the encounter on Mythic, on the Dungeon Journal,
oh god, yeah,
we're going to have some slices in phase 3.
Sinestro style orbs cutting. Yeah, that's going to be very interesting.
I'm not looking forward to that.
No, neither am I. It's going to be awful. But a couple of things that this fight could definitely do with improving. I'm sure it probably has done already, but a couple of things that we noticed during our testing is that how shitty the hitboxes were. Not only were the hitboxes of some of the tentacles really small, making it so melee DPS couldn't really hit them very well, especially on the elevated platforms. But probably the worst hitbox out of any of these in this fight was on Helya herself. Her hitbox was absolutely tiny. Even if a tank was just like 1 yard away from her, she'll just turn around and slap a melee DPS in the face, just one-shot them. It was really unforgiving.
You have to almost stand like right on the shoreline, right on that like cliff edge or whatever it is. If you're just 5 yards away from that, Helya's like, fuck you, I'm going to hit a melee.
Yeah, exactly.
And that happened almost every single pull.
Yeah, it wasn't
And when
nice.
the tanks have to move so much because of the breath and because of the green pool underneath them, it just seems a little bit silly. It feels like that hitbox could be doubled at least.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that would fix the problem.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be fixed. Like, it was a huge problem. I'm pretty sure everyone experienced it if they had melee DPS. And considering melee DPS don't seem to be particularly good on this fight just because of how spread out all of the ads are and all that kind of stuff and how unmelee friendly the Grime Lord is, adding that extra insult to them by having the hitboxes be shit just seems overkill. So I'm sure they'll make it so the hitboxes are fine. But one thing, of course, for us, which was really shit, was the boss despawning. That wasn't particularly nice either. Something to do with that, the right-hand side tentacle on the floor seemed to make it so if you dragged ads over there, because we always made it so the ads went near the tentacle so you could cleave it down. If we brung any big ads over there, like, it seemed to despawn the whole time. So hopefully these sort of like minor bugs like the hitbox being shit and the boss despawning will be fixed. But overall, I think this boss has a lot of potential to be an end boss that we can all really look forward to.
And on Mythic, it's going to be terrifying.
Yeah, it really is. Those
We're going to have
slices,
to deal with Sinestro slices.
Yeah.
Those orbs are going to fucking destroy everyone. But thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed this little boss preview. And if you did, slap a like on it. It helps us out so much. But before we go, I want to give a huge shout out to all our supporters over on Patreon. You guys keep us in this business, and if you would like to join those lovely group of people, the link is in the description. And we shall see you all with guides next week.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.